My neighbor died alone and left everything to my family, and I need to tell you why, because once you hear it you will not forget it. Frank Milner lived next door to us for 9 years, and I thought he was just a quiet old man who liked coffee and early mornings. I was wrong about that. Every Saturday without fail he would knock on my door at 8 in the morning with a thermos of coffee, and we would sit on the porch and talk. About the street, about the weather, about my son Danny's baseball games. Small things. Easy things. And I looked forward to it every single week more than I ever admitted to anyone. My wife Lisa used to say Frank was good for me. I told her he was just a neighbor. She gave me that look she always gave me when I was lying to myself and didn't know it yet. Frank was 72 when we met him. A retired teacher, a widower, no family that any of us knew of. He never had visitors. Nobody called for him. Nobody came by for the holidays or helped him with the yard in the fall. He was completely alone, and he seemed to have made peace with that a long time ago. But there were things about Frank I didn't know. Things that would have changed everything if I had known them sooner. He started getting sick in the spring of last year. I noticed, but I didn't push because Frank wasn't the kind of man who wanted you to make a fuss. He moved slower. He stayed inside more. By autumn I was the one bringing the coffee to him, and we would sit at his kitchen table instead of the porch, and sometimes we would just sit quietly with the radio on, and that was enough. He died on a Tuesday night in October. His doctor called me the next morning because I was the only contact Frank had listed. Not a son, not a cousin, not a single relative. Just me. I sat in my car in the driveway after that call for a long time. Lisa came outside and knocked on the window, and I rolled it down, and she looked at my face and said, "Frank," and I just nodded. She stood there in the cold without her coat and didn't go back inside until I was ready. We buried him 4 days later. Me, Lisa, Danny, and 2 people from the funeral home. Danny held my hand the entire time without me asking. He was 9 years old, and he understood that something important had ended even if he couldn't name exactly what it was. I thought that was the end of it. 3 weeks later an attorney called and asked me to come in. Her name was Carol Simmons, and when Lisa and I sat down across from her she opened a folder and said that Frank had left everything to our family. The house, his savings, his car, an investment account he had been quietly building for 30 years. The total was just over $380,000. I looked at her and said, "I think you have the wrong family." She looked straight back at me and said, "I don't." Then she reached into the folder and placed an envelope on the desk between us. My name was written on the front in Frank's handwriting. Careful, slightly uneven letters. The same handwriting from all those little notes he used to leave in my mailbox. She said, "Read this before you ask me anything." I looked at Lisa. She nodded. So I picked it up and opened it. And by the time I reached the second page my hands were shaking because Frank's letter wasn't about Frank at all. It was about my father. And about a secret my father had kept from me until the very end. My dad died 7 years ago, and I still reach for the phone to call him sometimes before I remember. He was my person. The one I called when something went wrong or when something went right or when nothing was happening at all and I just wanted to hear his voice. When he died I went quiet in a way I couldn't explain to anyone, and I think I carried that quietness around for years without realizing how much space it was taking up inside me. Frank's letter started with a line I had to read twice. He wrote that he and my father had been close friends for almost 10 years. I had never heard my father mention Frank. Not once. Not his name, not anything about him. And yet Frank wrote that they had been inseparable for nearly a decade in their 30s, before my dad got married and moved across the city and life got busy and the two of them slowly lost touch the way people do when they mean to hold on but never quite manage it. Frank wrote that my father was the best man he had ever known. And that losing that friendship over nothing more than distance and time was something he had quietly regretted for the rest of his life. I kept reading. And then I got to the part that made me put the letter flat on the desk and just breathe. Frank wrote that 8 months before my father died my father had called him. Out of nowhere. After years of almost no contact, my dad had tracked down Frank's number and called him on a Thursday night, and they had talked for almost 2 hours. My father told Frank he was sick. He hadn't told us the whole truth yet. He didn't know how. Frank wrote that my dad was frightened that night, not of dying but of leaving me. He said my father talked about me for a long time on that call. He said he was worried because I kept things inside and kept people at arm's length, and he didn't know how to break through that before it was too late. He said he was scared I would go through the rest of my life not letting anyone close enough to matter. My father died 6 weeks after that phone call. He told me he was sick only in the final 10 days. By then there wasn't enough time to say everything that needed to be said, and we both felt it, and neither of us said that out loud either. We just sat together in that hospital room and talked about small things and pretended the clock wasn't running out, and I have thought about those 10 days every single week since. I sat in Carol Simmons's office holding that letter and I could not speak. I thought about my father alone with all of that fear. Sick and scared and lying awake at night worrying not about himself but about me. Picking up the phone and calling a man he hadn't spoken to properly in years because he didn't know what else to do. And Frank answering. Frank listening. Frank saying yes. Because Frank wrote that before that call ended my father asked him for a promise. He asked Frank to look after me after he was gone. And Frank kept that promise in the most literal way possible. He found out where I lived. He saw that the house next door was for sale. And he bought it. He moved in 3 weeks after my father's funeral and showed up at my door with a casserole dish and said he was sorry for my loss, and I thanked him and thought nothing of it. 9 years of Saturday mornings. 9 years of bad coffee and slow conversation and easy silence on the porch. 9 years of Frank listening to me talk about Danny's baseball games and Lisa's work and whatever was weighing on me that week without ever once pushing or prying or making me feel like I needed to explain myself. 9 years of exactly what my father had asked him to give me. And I had no idea. Not a single idea. Frank wrote that he never planned to tell me while he was alive because he didn't want it to change how I felt about the time we spent together. He didn't want me to feel like our friendship was built on something artificial because it wasn't. He wrote that whatever had started as a promise had become something completely real to him. That those Saturday mornings had been some of the best hours of his last years. That sitting on that porch with me drinking bad coffee and talking about nothing had mattered to him in ways he didn't know how to say out loud but wanted me to know before he was gone. He wrote that he had no family left who needed what he had saved and that he had spent a long time thinking about where it should go. He wrote that the answer had never really been a question for him. He wanted it to go to Danny. He wanted it to go toward a future for a boy he had watched grow up and who had always made him feel like the world was still good. At the very bottom of the last page the handwriting was shakier than the rest, like he had written it last when his hand was tired. He wrote, "Your father asked me to make sure you were okay and I promised him I would, and I want you to know, Thomas, that I meant it, and I hope that somewhere along the way it helped even just a little." I folded the letter and held it in both hands and the room was completely silent. Lisa was crying quietly beside me. Carol Simmons was looking at the window. I sat there and I didn't try to hold anything back this time. I just let it come. All of it. 7 years of missing my father and not knowing how to say it, and 9 years of a man showing up every Saturday morning because he had made a promise to a dying friend and he took that promise more seriously than most people take anything. I drove home after the meeting and I went straight to the garage. In the back corner behind the lawnmower there were 3 boxes of my father's things I had brought home after he died and never once opened. 7 years they had been sitting there in the dark. I had told myself I would go through them when I was ready, and I had spent 7 years finding reasons not to be ready. I carried all 3 boxes into the kitchen. I called Danny in from the living room and he came and stood in the doorway and looked at the boxes and then looked at me, and I said, "Come sit with me, I want to show you who your grandfather was." He sat down across from me without a word. And I opened the first box and I started telling my son about his grandfather. About the man my father was before he was my father. About the friend he had been to, a quiet old man who moved next door to keep a promise. About the kind of person worth becoming. We sat there together until it was dark outside and neither of us noticed the time.